I think we'll slowly get started. Welcome to all of the attendants of this meeting. My name is Bram de Wilde. I'm a Ghent, Belgium-based pediatric oncologist and a member of the Accelerate Fit for Filing group. Today we are here gathered together to have a webinar with you on the work of the Fit for Filing working group, where we will try to discuss the work we did over the last years and the conclusions we drew from that work. The program for the webinar of today is I will first start with a short 20 to 30 minutes introduction, where we will discuss actually the work we did, so the problem that we're facing, the historical perspective, why we arrived at that situation, about the legislation that is in place, and define the Fit for Filing problem together with you as a sort of an introduction to a follow-up panel discussion we will have, and we will try to restrict that to a 1-hour discussion, although we have a very active working group, and the panelists, of course, most of them are members of the working group. So we will try to keep that discussion to 1 hour and hope to inform you on the Fit for Filing problem that we defined and what we intend to do to help resolve it. So getting started with the actual introduction, most of you will be familiar with the numbers we're listing here. They depict the success, or at least the lack of success, and the huge efforts that are required to make a drug into an actual medicine, so a medicine ready for the treatment of patients. Drugs that make it into clinical trials, so which is a small part of the actual drugs that ever get tested. The development success definitely is not guaranteed. The process of regulatory approval, listed here in red, resulting from a filing application done by the usually the patent holder or the one that has the medicine in its portfolio, can only be allowed to happen, of course, for drugs where there is robust and reliable evidence that it's effectively results in patient benefit. If today in this webinar we are talking about filing, we mean the process of preparing all the information that is available on a drug and preparing it in such a way that the regulatory bodies of the countries where you want to file actually can evaluate this information and see the value of your potential medicine. If we look at the historical perspective in pediatric oncology, most of you will probably be familiar with this situation. We've seen spectacular improvements in the survival rates for children for most types of cancers over the last decades, the previous century. The evolution is somewhat stagnating over the last 20 years, indicating the need for new innovation, and through innovation in pediatric cancer treatment. The huge progress that has been made in the past is mainly due to the hard work of large national and international clinical trial consortia that ran trials in children with cancer with continuously improving multimodal combination therapies. More often than not, medication has been used in these trials in an off-label fashion. Safety and efficacy data that we do have on this medicine and these regimens usually this is derived from these large trials that have been run, and not so much of the individual research on the individual medication available. To stimulate much needed innovation in rare diseases in general and pediatric diseases, including oncology in particular, many governments have put in place legislation to stimulate the development of medication for these niche markets. The examples we show here of the United States and the European Union and the legislation to stimulate this innovation. Both the US and the EU require certain steps in the drug development for children to have occurred before a drug can be approved or can obtain what we call a marketing authorization in the European Union. Although the timing and the exact requirements can vary, it varies across the Atlantic, but it can vary in other countries that are not listed here as well. some similarities in the situation do exist. Where in the USA, you need a clear plan on the pediatric studies to be able to get approval. Although modification to this plan and the execution of the trials that are stipulated in this plan do not need to be complete at that time. In Europe, the studies that were agreed upon when the adult PK data actually became available need to be performed according to an agreed upon timeline that are in check with the submission and review process. Marketing authorization in this specific situation is only a first step, of course, as the member states of the European Union still have their national health authorities evaluating the medicine as well. And that reevaluation, of course, is required before reimbursement at the national level is possible. If you really want to learn more about the legislation that's in place, the Accelerate Consortium actually has two webinars that are very high quality on the website already, and I invite you to go and visit them because we will not go into detail on the legislation in this webinar. So the links I'll provide it here. So what is actually fit for filing? By filing, again, we mean the process of gaining approval or marketing authorization, or meeting any of the other requirements that a country might impose before a drug can really make it into the market, can be used by patients and reimbursed. And of course, these decisions need to be supported by data. This data usually is provided in what we list here, a common technical document, and the structure is depicted here in this pyramid. But very obviously, this process of evaluation requires data. And some of that data in the module 2 in this pyramid is actually derived from clinical trials testing the use of this new potential medicine in healthy and diseased subjects. Asking if data is fit for filing is actually asking if the data would allow the regulatory authorities to thoroughly evaluate and approve a drug. And running a trial fit for filing to us just means that the data resulting from that trial is captured in such a way that it meets this fit for filing criteria, that this evaluation process can happen. Regulatory agencies have defined criteria of quality and what is required, not to be confused with the module 3 here, the quality data on the product itself, but quality data on these clinical trials to allow traceability and to allow the evaluation of a new potential medicine. Do we have a fit for filing problem in pediatrics? That is a first question we as a group raised, of course. And yes, we do feel we have that problem. If we look at a very recent publication of groups of the COG, where they did compare the first-in-child studies and the delay that was there on the first-in-human to first-in-child use, there actually was a median delay of 6.5 years present. During an era of roughly 20 years, only 26% of the first-in-child studies were actually industry-sponsored, and only 6 oncology drugs actually had an initial approval, so initial filing that included children. And of these drugs, most of them were actually an acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a disease that is the most common oncology type in children, but also a disease that actually occurs in adults, and where the treatment differences in between the adult and the pediatric population are not all that large. So these two quotes actually depict this contrast in between the pediatric and the adult opinion, where some people might feel that a 6.5-year delay is appropriate to have more safety data available on the drug before we give it to children. And this is a governing opinion among pediatric oncologists and patients and parents of patients affected by these diseases, feel that when you're dealing with life-threatening diseases, a 6.5-year delay for medication innovation to happen is actually completely unacceptable. Going further, but without going really into detail on the reason for this delay, it is very clear that there still is a difference in commitments that are made towards drug development in pediatric oncology as opposed to oncology in general, so adult oncology. If we look at the clinicaltrials.gov database, and this is a very rough analysis, and we just list the funding sources for the clinical trials that have been run in the last 20 years in oncology reveals a twofold difference in the commitment made by industry. So the red and blue colors here in this graph. So the commitments made in the pediatric space with 25% of industry involvement as opposed to roughly 50% of industry involvement in the adult space. Pediatric trials in oncology just still seem to have a larger than average involvement of academia or a smaller than average involvement of industry when it comes to sponsoring the trial in oncology. The Accelerate Fit for Filing Working Group actually aim to explore this larger than average involvement, or to explore this difference and to see whether this difference in involvement is actually reason for concern with regard to trials resulting in data that is fit for filing. To this aim, we devised a working group, a Fit for Filing working group, that focused actually on exploring the current collaborative model of running trials that is so typical to pediatric oncology drug development, and to analyze why so little of these trials that are actually run very high quality standards, why so little of these trials are resulting in filing applications for drugs, and if that is the case, how we could improve on this situation. I do want to express my gratitude to the people listed on these slides. And as you can see, the Accelerate Consortium that has all stakeholders represented made it a lot easier to have all of the stakeholders, so academia, regulatory affairs, patient advocacy, industry people, and a lot of others, to be involved in this Fit for Filing working group. A special thanks, of course, to the people that made the meetings and this meeting actually possible. So I have to thank Beatrice and Carol specifically for their efforts done in the last years to help us achieve these goals. The methodology that we followed actually was first to explore the current situation. And we did this by developing some surveys that were actually sent out to the industry and academic partners that are stakeholders that are involved in drug development. Industry partners were mainly questioned on their previous experience in working with academia, either positive or negative, what worked, what didn't work. While the academic partners, some of the larger academic institutions involved in sponsoring drug development for pediatric oncology, were actually questioned on their, be it self-evaluated capabilities and the resources that they have available to develop trials and to run trials. The surveys then resulted in some consensus building discussions that were actually supplemented with some case studies. We did invite some additional external experts on specific topics to the working group to understand where collaborations sometimes did or sometimes did not work and why actually they did and didn't work. To finally end up with some recommendations that we formulated that were actually recently published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. Publication should be available via open access for you to read. So we do realize that there are some limitations to the methodology that we followed. To give you one example, the industry partners that were present were mainly involved in large pharma, small biotech that actually is responsible for a lot of the innovation in oncology drug development, was not surveyed in our surveys. It is, of course, very important to note that the capabilities that we asked academic partners about were actually self-assessed. There was not an objective template that they needed to meet, and we did not check whether what they reported was actually true. But from the discussions that we had, it was really clear that there is a huge variety in the way that an academic partner and an industry partner, so a pharma partner, would approach things like data management and trial management, although everybody involved was actually very aware of good clinical practices and was compliant to these practices. This is very briefly, because of course in the published manuscript we extend upon this a lot more, very briefly what resulted from these group discussions, namely the identification of some knowledge and expertise gaps that exist and that we can possibly address to improve the running of collaborative trials. Academic institutes, they do run a lot of trials, but very few of these trials actually have an intention to file. And some of the academic institutions have little to no experience with intent to file trials. On the other hand, the industry partners only run trials with an intent to file. Otherwise, they tend not to run the trials. With regard to data management and documentation, there's also a huge difference that we identified. Although documentation and data management happen in both academic and industry-run clinical trials, there definitely is a difference in between the very extended data verification that is really central to industry trials or to industry data management plans, actually. And this seemed to be the first thing where an academic run trial will actually fall a bit short of the fit for filing idea and the fit for filing grade data collection. Industry, on the other hand, tended to sort of over collect data just to make sure that nothing is lost and that nothing is forgotten. And this too is identified as a practice that maybe should be slightly mitigated. In the following part of our webinar, we will explore these topics more in depth in a panel discussion with some of the leading experts in pediatric oncology drug development. I want to introduce you to the panel, but first I want to invite you to the second and third webinar that we have actually planned. The second one having a focus on data management. So we will deliberately not be addressing this topic in the webinar of today. Document with rationale and common data elements and differences that might exist and be specific for pediatric trials will be the focus of that webinar. The third webinar is on the data management strategies and trials and actually the resources involved in running a collaborative clinical trial as much as possible. The panel we have collected for you today is actually representing all stakeholders. So we have, on the one hand, Professor Pamela Currens and Elizabeth Fox representing actually large academic institutions from both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. For the regulatory affairs, we have the honor of having Dr. Martha Donoghue available for the FDA, and for the European side, Dr. Dominic Corres and Dr. Kim Peach, who is an experienced GCP inspector, will be joining us in the discussion. For industry, Doctors Barry Ellie and Mark Kieran are present, both with extensive experience in multiple companies that have run pediatric oncology trials. And last but not least, of course, Daniel Ludwinski was kindly representing the patient voice, the patient advocate voice in our panel. Thank you for listening. We will allow the audience to have some level of interaction during the panel discussion. So if you feel compelled to ask a question, a burning question, we will try to answer that. There is no option to do a live asking of questions, but you can use the chat of the webinar to ask us questions even during the panel discussion. I will do my best, and the panel members will do their best to pick up your questions and try to address them as good we can. I now invite all the panel members to switch on their cameras and to join me in the panel discussion. Thank you. Sharing here. Make sure that I can all see you and also look in the chat. So people, please do use that chat if you have any burning questions. Again, we will try to address them during the discussions that we have. Okay, the knowledge and expertise gaps that we identified from the discussions we had, I think the first thing we need to discuss, and let me address the academic partners first here, is on previous experience. Professor Kearns, do you want to elaborate maybe a bit on the responses we got from the academic partners and what type of trials they are used to running and their previous experience?
Thanks, Bram, and thank you for a great summary of the work of the committee up to now. So when we surveyed the major academic institutions that are running clinical trials in pediatric oncology, universally, obviously, they're used to running academic trials. And everybody knows that in pediatric oncology, how heavily trial focused we are in all our patient treatment protocols. The experience of working with industry was highly variable. And I think most places had experience of working with industry where perhaps they had had a drug provided to do a clinical trial, maybe an educational grant. The shift from that to what you've been describing and what we've been discussing of a full fit for filing trial was only really undertaken in a few centres. And in those centres, not in a systematic way. It was a one-to-one discussion with a particular drug company where they basically tried to invent the wheel to do it. And I think what is really clear is that when, and I speak for my own institution as well, obviously we've shifted a lot in this process, but if I think back to where we were, we ran, fully GCP compliant clinical trials, but perhaps didn't understand the gap between that and what was needed by the drug companies to put together a full filing application. And so there is sometimes discussions about, for example, on, well, why do you need all that safety data? What do you mean by, these monitoring plans, which are very different from the way, or data management plans rather, which are very different from the way we run our own standard operating procedures. So it sometimes felt like we were talking a slightly different language from the drug companies. So it was a long discussion about what was actually needed, and very much looking at it from the academic perspective and very much what we're used to in a patient pathway. And I know we'll come on to a bit later on about perhaps sometimes we were right about what was needed, but on the other hand, we do have to make sure that what we deliver is of sufficient quality if we're going to go into these fit for filing trials in the future. So I'd say the experiences were very wide, very varied, and I think this has been a valuable exercise to identify the gaps.
Yeah, but you would agree across the Atlantic that indeed academic institutions have that same level of experience, or do you feel there are differences indeed?
No, I agree with Professor Kearns on sort of the general evolution, and I truly see this as an evolution and a growing partnership for what we all share as the common goal, which is to have the best and most innovative therapies achieve regulatory approval so that they can be equitably available to all patients, and ideally throughout the world. From the academic perspective, I have watched and worked in a number of large academic settings. I agree that, we can comply with GCP. We understand, we are focused on quality of the data. I think to date, the gap has existed in what I would refer to as the verification of the quality of that data and how that verification is documented, stored, and transferred into regulatory filings. I'll also take just a second to comment from a cooperative group perspective. It's, in the US, the large cooperative groups are largely, coalitions of academic investigators. And so many bring the same perspectives. I think the challenge to us now, and one of the things that I think is the importance of this webinar and discussion, is I have personally, and in the roles that I have, seen an increase in the number of times that industry sponsors have come back after an academic trial is completed and said, wow, we would like to consider using some of the data from that to support a regulatory filing, not necessarily the pivotal trial. And certainly from the St. Jude perspective, we are very much attuned to trying to do that and recognize that going back historically is extraordinarily difficult, but not impossible. Additionally, we have recently entered into a prospective contract with a large pharmaceutical company to run a St. Jude sponsored trial that the industry partner has begun from the very beginning, made it clear that they would like to consider using this data for regulatory filing. It has changed the way we consider the entire trial development and all the support structures around that. So I think it's an evolution. Go ahead.
Yeah, would you indeed feel that this is an evolution, that historically the focus on filing wasn't there, and that indeed is changing when we run now or discuss about an academic trial? Or should we still really change that attitude of academic consortia that they really consider that filing up front?
If you want me to come back on that, Bram,
Sure.
I think the landscape is definitely shifting, and it's shifting on both sides. I think industry, I think Beth described that really fantastically about that retrospective. Oh, that might be interesting now, but I think that shift has definitely happened, that we're having the conversations at the beginning. We're looking at doing a trial with an innovative new drug. The aim of it, whether it's academic or industry, is can we, if it's effective, can we get a license? And having those conversations up front as to what that might look like, both in terms of trial design, but also trial delivery, the needle is definitely shifting.
Mm-hmm. That I mean, seamlessly, let us go to the partners from industry. So Mark and Ellie, thank you so much for joining us here. Do you feel that indeed in industry that change and trend and how we collaborate with academic partners is indeed changing, and why might that be? What's previous experience of industry working with academia, and what might have led to a change in attitude there?
I can start. I mean, I think in large part, we have to acknowledge the impact of the pediatric research regulations, right? In the last 15 years, where, previously it was, optional voluntary, was, up to each individual company to decide whether or not they wanted to do any type of pediatric clinical research. And I think with the advent of the European regulations, and now after the RACE Act, obviously industry is responding, and specifically in the pediatric oncology space, where academic investigators and cooperative groups have obviously played a central role in the study and development of drugs, for decades. It's a realization that you can't just conduct these studies in a vacuum, and really you rely on the experts and the folks that have been in the field for years and really have access to the patients. So it's sort of forced this type of collaboration, but I think in a good way, in a way to benefit both ultimately the academic research, the sort of the requirements now on industry from regulators, and ultimately for patients.
You would agree, Mark, that indeed, yeah.
Well, just I would add that there's been a huge shift. When I started in pediatric oncology, everything was about iterations of the same cyclophosphamide, or and really a pediatric trial was just a different, pinch more of this, tad less of that. So none of it was particularly novel in the true sense of the word. And obviously the genomics explosion, targeted therapies, immunotherapy have altered the way I think every pediatric oncologist, and therefore the way every company thinks about the opportunity for drug development. It's interesting, when I first started in pharma, how often the adult people were complaining about how hard it is, because as the molecular revolution kind of takes hold, their large groups of breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer were getting smaller and smaller as they divided them into molecular subtypes, something that as pediatric oncologists, we've been doing since really day one. And so it's, I definitely think there's been a shift, and I agree with Ellie completely. The regulations have been absolutely critical. But I think there are a couple of other things that are helping the change, and Ellie and I think are part of this. There are now a couple of companies, of which Day One is one, focused on the development of drugs for kids. I have to say, when I started in pediatric oncology, a drug company for kids would have been unimaginable. And there's not just one of them, there are actually a couple of them up and running now. I think that's one thing. The other thing is, I think the pediatric oncologists in pharmaceutical companies have started to gain a much greater voice, in part because the regulations are forcing drug companies to listen a little more to pediatrics, which means the pediatric oncologists in those companies. I was at BMS for a couple of years before coming to Day One, and you could begin to see the shift, that some of what we were saying was actually reaching levels that I don't think it had reached before. And I think that's also been part of the shift that we're beginning to see in the mentality of industry towards pediatrics.
Of course, I think, Donna, that is something that we're quite happy to hear, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so maybe addressing that same problem, same question to people from the regulatory bodies. Marta, Dominic, do you feel, I mean, did we reach the goal? Did the legislation indeed work? Is that what we wanted?
Thanks for the question. I wouldn't presume to say that we've gotten what we wanted, because, you know, I think the passage of the RACE Act was really an effort, you know, from advocates, you know, really advocate driven. And I wouldn't want to speak to all of the kind of goals of the RACE Act, but, and the other legislation, BPCA, et cetera. I would say, certainly from my perspective, and I've been at the FDA now for, gosh, 13 years, just about at this point, I have seen, I have to, you know, agree, I do agree with everything I've heard so far today about the kind of the force of the positive momentum really kind of accelerating over time. You know, when I started at the agency, you know, I felt in some ways that my skills as a pediatric oncologist were, you know, not being used that much, because we weren't seeing many drug development programs for children. And so, you know, and that has definitely shifted almost exponentially over the past, you know, 10 years. And I think the reasons for this are multifactorial, certainly, as many of the people said, this you know, scientific progress, you know, driving a better molecular understanding of adult and pediatric cancers. The legislation certainly driving more of a need for, you know, and you know, interaction amongst industry, academicians and regulators. So I do think we are well on our way. I think we're in a pretty optimistic time. The RACE Act has not been enacted for very long, having, you know, only kind of come into effect as of August 18th, 2020. But I will say that our experience, even prior to that, once it was known that the RACE Act was, you know, was passed, we started seeing a lot more engagement with industry. In particular, much more of a collaborative spirit, exchange of scientific kind of information, et cetera, that's being driven by that legislation in particular. So, you know, the end results, you know, remain to be seen, because many of these pediatric study plans are really new and nascent, and you know, many of the plans we've agreed on, you know, the trials are not yet underway. But I do think, you know, I'm hopeful that 5 years from now, you know, we'll have some, you know, really tangible evidence beyond just sort of the increased interaction, increased number of plans to kind of point to and say, yes, this has been very much a success. But I definitely would like to hear Donna's perspective on that.
Yeah, I think
as well.
Yeah, we could, Dominic, I mean, communication, that's key, right? I mean, that was clear from all the discussions that we had, that this interaction, this open communication is actually very important. Do you feel indeed that this is sufficiently embedded really in the process already with all the partners, or do you, Dominic?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the fact that we're having this webinar with all stakeholders around the table to discuss what does fit for filing mean, I think shows us that I think that we have achieved a lot. But I think that we need to continue as you know, is exactly, I think, the objective of the work that the Fit for Filing group did, and in that regard. Certainly, I think communication is fundamental. Not only communication, but also collaboration, and to sort of, you know, from a regulatory perspective, to appreciate and to instill a sense of appreciation that regulators are sort of equal partners in this endeavor to make novel agents accessible to all patients is, I think, for me, what I would hope we would get to, you know, in the future. And with bringing that back to the fit for filing sort of discussion to sort of, you know, remind that fit for filing is on one hand adequate prospectively designed studies, adequate to make regulatory decision making on benefit risk, and then the point on data quality eventually, which is what we're discussing here when we talk about fit for filing, and to sort of work together in getting everyone around to understand what does this actually mean and what is my eventual responsibility in this as an individual stakeholder. And that's where I see we have achieved a lot, but I think we need to continue to work on.
Would the panel agree that the intent of running a trial that in academia would traditionally be practice changing publication, that type of communication is not sufficient anymore, that we should be thinking beyond that as academics?
I think it depends on the nature of the trial. I mean, Mark mentioned that in the old days, if I could call it that way, but it still carries on. You know, some of our late phase trials are about treatment improvement, giving chemotherapy in a different way, a different intensity, combining it with radiotherapy. And the endpoint of those studies should be practice changes in practice guidelines. The difference here is that we're more and more doing academic trials where we're bringing drugs into the trial that aren't licensed in the pediatric population or even licensed for that indication, where we want the label to change. We're so used in pediatric oncology giving drugs off label, and it's fine to say historically that was the case. You know, doxorubicin, cyclophosphamide, what didn't go through the same sort of studies to get a pediatric label or when they were being developed. That doesn't mean it's okay now. And as we bring the new immunotherapies online, the new targeted therapies, we want them to be properly evaluated in pediatrics. We want the label to have pediatric safety data, pediatric formulation data, and pediatric efficacy data. And I think it's a lot to ask companies to be able to generate that standalone from academic consortiums, because we use these drugs as part of treatment pathways. And that's really difficult for an industry partner to just run those trials where they're going to have to take into account the whole treatment pathway, all the other modalities. Whereas if we can embed that question within an academic trial, but run it such that the data that's generated is of the right quality, and also it is actually designed in a way to answer the question, because you can give a good data package with great quality, but if you haven't designed the trial to answer the question in the way the regulators need to have it answered to be able to make that benefit risk judgment, then you've actually wasted a lot of time. So I do think that it is not just the quality, but it's also about the design.
So the interaction, when ideally should it occur? It's an open question, please. Maybe Marta?
Before the
please.
trial is conducted, and as early as possible, frankly.
As early as possible.
I mean, we recognize, or at least, you know, as regulators, we don't want to, you know, intrude and place ourselves, you know, as an obstacle to clinical trials, you know, being conducted, certainly, and along with, you know, Pam and others have said, the purpose of clinical trials in pediatric oncology really can vary. And there are definitely, you know, places where we don't need to be involved as regulators, certainly. But when there's a chance for a new drug that either has never been approved or has been approved in adults but doesn't have a pediatric indication, when there is the potential for that trial to provide data that can support, you know, either in solely or in part, you know, a future regulatory filing, new indication for kids, then it's so much better to start talking to us early. You know, and sometimes there'll need to be an iterative discussion, a meeting of the minds, you know, between academicians, regulatory agencies, and we should be working together as we do and continue to, so that we can align as much as possible in industry, so that we can discuss the, you know, the different objectives that everybody might have. You know, the common goal, of course, is to improve the lives of children with cancer and have them live long, be cured, have the best medicine possible accessible. And sometimes there are other academic questions that need to be answered that are important to patients, and trying to sit down and figure out, like, this is what everybody wants. What are the most important things that we need to get out of this trial? And what is feasible, and you know, how can we construct something that makes sense for all parties?
Yeah, Mark, I think over to you, but I just want to say to the attendees of the meeting, please keep posting your questions. We have one question already in the chat. We will address it just later on, the data management. But please, Mark, continue.
I would just, the one thing I'd want to say is, Martha, I completely agree. The problem is it has to even start much, I mean, by the time the trial is running, you're absolutely right. The conversations have to have taken place. But when you think about the way pharma develops a drug with all of the preclinical biology, figuring out in what diseases it might be relevant and what combinations and so forth, if you're not doing the preclinical biology early on, you're not going to know where in pediatrics you necessarily want to use it. And obviously, the reality is that large pharma, you know, they probably have thousands of breast, prostate, colon, lung cancer mouse models, and where they can be testing their drugs to look at activity. But most large pharma are not going to have a whole range of neuroblastoma, medulloblastoma, Ewing sarcoma. That's where the academic collaboration becomes so critical, which means you have to be thinking about this not when it's already approved in adults. I would argue the whole point, hopefully, of fit of filing is that we could not keep approving things in adult and then think peds, is that we would be thinking peds at the same time, which means the biology for peds has to begin to be thought of at about the same time. That you've got a drug, you've got a target, you're interested in adults, and you've now got to start asking the question for peds. The one other thing I wanted to just say is, you know, we talked about industry running a trial, but there isn't a single company that actually has pediatric patients in their office. That by definition is only done through academia. So there's no such thing as an industry trial without an academic component to it. In fact, the academic component is really the foundation on which the trial runs. And under those circumstances, it has to be more, it's always been a partnership. It just has to be a more effective and efficient partnership.
Mark, and
I agree, Mark.
Go ahead, Martha. Sorry.
No.
Mark, I was just speaking from a regulatory perspective. You know, I think first interactions should occur, you know, as early as possible, you know, even ideally before a clinical trial on adults, if you can. But in terms of when we need to be brought in, it's you know, as early as you think we can be helpful, and that, and generally before. And with the current IPSC process, we are engaging earlier, which is even better. So whenever we're here to serve you. And so whenever you think you need us, you should reach out, certainly. Go ahead, Beth.
Thanks. And I would just add to the comments so far that, you know, when we think about what I'm hearing is, you know, there really isn't as huge a divide between, you know, academics as a silo and industry as a silo, because we all agree it's a partnership. And Mark makes great points about the responsibility of academic pediatric investigators to really begin to generate that data early and discuss it early. I think the one place that I consider a place that we as investigators and with our industry partners have to think very critically is the goals of academics from the investigator perspective. Pam outlined nicely, sort of publication, changing standards of care, making sure we're getting innovative therapies to our patients and they're available. It's the gap I often find falls in the infrastructure behind the academic investigator to really permit the level of interaction with industry, with regulators, to support that in a way that has a long-term goal beyond individual patients and looking toward regulatory filing.
I think that seamlessly brings us to the discussion on what you expect from each of the partners. What should they bring to the table? What should they bring to the discussion? So that you would define that infrastructure to that interaction with regulatory bodies to be something that you expect pharma to bring to a trial negotiation, trial discussion?
So I'll start by saying, it depends on the venue in which the academic investigator functions. I don't think that industry necessarily needs to bring the infrastructure, but I think we have to agree on how to support and resource the infrastructure for success for all.
Yeah, I completely agree with Beth on that. We cannot be naive to think that if we're going to run any clinical trial, whether it's fit for filing or not, that we do this from just off with an investigator and a trial manager. It does take a huge amount of additional support. But if we're going to move into delivering something at this level, at the fit for filing level, then we do need a proper infrastructure around it. And the clinical trials unit that I run, we do have that level of expertise in terms of the breadth of expert people, from trial management through to quality management through to statistics. But the additional resource that goes on top when you layer what we do normally for academia and what we really need to do for a fit for filing trial takes a personnel resource and time that is not intrinsic to what we have. And to be able to fit that gap, then we do need our industry partners to recognize that they're going to have to fund that. It can't just be done on a typical academic budget. We need to bring that to the table. And if we do, if we end up doing this regularly, and it won't be every investigator doing it in their own hospital, there will be certain units around, in different countries that have the expertise to do it. Big organizations like COG and St. Jude's, and some of the big sponsoring institutions in the ITCC. But if we shift to this and we shift that resource and expertise availability within our institutions, then we're going to be able to respond better. We're not going to be able to do it from scratch for every single trial. We're going to have to build the infrastructures.
Going back to you, Mark, but I just want to go to Donna, that has been involved in a lot of fundraising for running trials actually in children. Is that something that as a fundraiser you realize, and as a parent that you feel is important indeed?
That's a great question, Bram, and I think about it an awful lot. I mean, the experience of being on this working group has been a huge, important education for me with the funder hat on, because in general, I don't think charities ever ask those questions. They don't say, are you planning for success? What is industry bringing to bear on the resource needs for this? So if you don't know the question to ask, you're certainly not going to be bringing that discussion to the table when you're considering funding. Over the past 15 years or so, we've funded over 30 clinical trials in a minor or a major way. And looking back and seeing how many opportunities we missed to really look at this, now I'm excited because it's a new day and things are moving forward. But honestly, I think this is something that all charities that get involved funding pediatric clinical research, they really, really need to be up to speed on this. So to answer your question, yes, now when we're considering funding a trial, there's a lot more nuance that's going on. What is the industry partner doing? Are they just providing drug and hands off, it's your trial, academia, or are they really having these in-depth conversations up front about planning for success? So anyway, I think it's an exciting time, and I think it's an important piece of this whole education effort.
I do feel that you created more opportunity than you missed, Donna, but thanks for that. I want to go back to Mark, and Mark, you have a fan in the chat, so Natalie Gaspar is actually completely agreeing with you and addressing the audience attention to the FAIR trial group of Accelerate. That really, we need that evidence, that preclinical evidence, before we can run trials. So Mark, please, you had a comment.
Well, I wanted to kind of, even before she said it, I wanted to support what Donna had said. Obviously, philanthropy is going to be, and foundations are going to be critically important in covering some of this. As somebody from a small company that has limited resources, we can't fund every fit for filing trial. So there we have, most people may not be aware of this, but industry typically has kind of 3 categories of trials. The ISTs, where the investigator is responsible for everything. We may provide drug, we may even provide a little money, but it's basically the investigator's trial to do as they wish. And obviously we'd like to see if more of those would fit for filing. There's a category that many pharmaceutical companies use. It comes under different names, but it's basically an investigator-sponsored trial, IST, of special interest or special focus, where actually there is some support by the company for the collection of data that might be important. And I think that was one of the things that Beth was talking about for the St. Jude study. There are multiple companies that are doing that routinely, versus the out-and-out company-sponsored trial, where all of the regulatory stuff is built into the very structure of the trial. But it's important to remember that we kind of talk about industry as a thing. When I was actually deciding to leave academia and went to look in industry, I interviewed at some companies that said, yeah, we absolutely want to hire you. We need to check the box that we've got a pediatric person so that we can kind of say that that's done, but we have no interest in pediatrics whatsoever. So you need to realize that there are some pediatric companies critically focused on peds, many adult large pharma that have an interest in peds, and some companies that don't care at all. So you're going to get a very heterogeneous response. And so you can't just take one no and think that that represents all of industry. It's a matter of really understanding what the company needs. They might want a fit for filing trial, but can't afford it. This is where maybe they work more with foundations to make sure that exactly the point that was made, that what we end up doing best for the patient in the long term is always front and center.
Yeah, and Natalie adds that industry indeed should dare to commit to doing this, but as you indicate, there's a lot of nuance to be added to that commitment and to what can be expected and what can be done. I can see a couple of questions in the chat going on about actually data management, and data management is actually one of the focuses of one of the gaps that we identified. I think it's appropriate that we switch to how actually the partners deal with trial data, what the differences are, and why some practices might not result or might result in fit for filing data. There is a question on the use of Cedis and C- type guidelines. I do want to address that participant specifically, that we will address that in the third webinar in a lot of detail, but I think we can open that discussion to the panel. Data management practices, they are different. Why are they different? How are they different? I think maybe we start again with the academic partners.
Beth, do you want to go?
Thanks. So, data management encompasses a lot of things. And I think one of the things I've learned along the course of my career is what I originally thought data management was, and what, from a regulatory perspective, data management encompasses are very different things. I would say that it is important to define that early with what the goals are, and understand what would need to be brought to bear for data management. I would say when we think about a classic definition of data management, which is, getting the data from the source document and getting it into databases and oversight of those databases, it is among the most expensive things that we do in clinical research. It is also one of the least glamorous things that we do in clinical research. And for those reasons, I think it does present challenges, especially in the academic space. But I think forums like this are critically important for understanding that, or at least opening our eyes to the scope of what that can mean. Pam, what do you want to say?
Yeah, as always, Beth, I completely agree with you. It's really funny. We spend a huge amount of time talking about the research question, the objectives, writing the protocol, writing the grant application, and then it's all we need a database. And it's really the two things need to go together. And I think there's sometimes a feeling that the database is just a tool in which you just capture the data to do the analysis, but it is actually the core of the trial. And fortunately not in pediatric oncology, but I came across something quite recently which made my toes curl, where people were talking about using Excel spreadsheets to collect trial data, which just on every level is just wrong. People need, what we need to understand is that that data that you collect ultimately is what's going to determine what happens to a patient in the future. So it needs to be accurate, first of all. It needs to answer the question in the trial, and collecting lots of unnecessary data just dilutes that accuracy, I'm afraid, because there's only a certain amount of resource, and it needs to be reproducible. We need to make sure that, you know, every change, sometimes, you know, put data in that is incorrect, that needs to be corrected, you know, just an error in data entry, but gets picked up in a monitoring. But any change needs to be trackable, completely verifiable. So everything that database represents every part that happens in the trial. And so it's incredibly important to get it correct. And I think that particularly in academia with our limited resources, we do well in that area, but that when you're going to move into the fit for filing, it goes into a whole different level of verification that we have to embrace. And to be honest, it will improve our academic trials as well. So it is a full pathway from the data being entered at the hospital site, which we know is resource intensive, right through to how it's verified and monitored in the trials unit that's running the trial or in the sponsor that's running the trial. It's a full pathway. So the question was, you know, is it important for academia to adapt to the Cedis guidelines and CRF designing? The answer is actually yes. That's not to say there aren't things we could bring to the table that could maybe improve the current system, but we have to recognize we can't just do what we're doing at the moment and expect that to be accepted by the regulators.
Yeah. I think we have a good opportunity here. We have Dr. Kim Peach here, that is actually a very experienced GCP inspector. Could you comment on data quality, on the importance of that to make a filing application valid, to make it possible to, and do you see any potential issues from these collaborative trials that are run?
Yeah, just on this, what Pam was just saying, it also when I was doing my thesis in a translational research institute, you know, it was like, okay, we believe in the product, you know, from the academic point of view, scientific, but then, okay, how do you document this? And then, as you said, you know, doing data management, this is not something you do like after business hours, just in between. It needs to be like predefined on this. And GCP basically states, if I remember correctly, there should be a data management plan. So as you all know, R3 is underway, and I'm sure people are looking for the next phase for public consultation from the concept. But I think there's both things. It certainly is. Also, I heard doing inspections being out there, like you're asking, like, for so much, is this really relevant? Or otherwise phrased, does it make us different? And I think this is also where, going back to the question, like early designing it in the first place correctly and focusing on the critical to success factors, or however you want to name those things, because we don't want, and it's now every resources on either end are limited. It's also on our end, it's limited. So we want to know, and also we don't want academia, Spongy and others to do things which may know, or you think it is important for us regulators, but then it may not be. So it's also to match expectation. And I think here again, going back on the importance on communication. So
yeah. Do you feel that from your experience that in trials that are being filed, that discussion has usually been extensive enough to avoid things like over collecting data or data that's not relevant, or do you see that happening a lot still in trials?
I would say it's a mixed picture. It's also, you know, so I did almost all of my inspections like in relation to a centralized marketing authorization in Europe. So it's like really, you know, so getting there for product and application. So it's already, you know, it's a big success. You know, the vast majority don't even reach those milestones, I would probably say. And then it's like, really, it's important. But I think it's, generally speaking, when I saw, because it's one thing, okay, did you had regulatory advice or scientific guidance early on, which then also helps, okay, what was discussed back then, seeing, okay, talking with our internal scientist, okay, why was it done like this, to really put things into perspective. So I think it's probably, I haven't seen where an early interaction with regulatory hurt. And especially also on the collection of data, there's also the concept of you shouldn't collect more data than actually necessary, which is also then when it comes back to consent and subject rights.
Yeah, that is something, Marta and Dominic, that we heard a lot during the discussions, right? Don't be afraid to interact early. It is still, there's still some barriers that people experience. What do you feel, Dominic?
Yeah, I mean it brings me exactly back to what I said at the beginning. I would hope we're seen as equal partners here as well, and as an equal partner, there shouldn't be any anxiety to engage. We don't want to make life difficult. We just want to ensure that we are able to assess benefit and risk of a product, so that a medicine which is essentially safe and efficacious and of good quality is able to reach all patients. And of course that means we have to adhere to certain requirements, but I would argue that this is in everyone's interest to start with. And I think that sort of equal partnership of all is what what I'm hearing and what I'm hoping we can also get across, and therefore, yeah, engaging, getting in touch, and discussing early and repetitively, ultimately, as Martha was saying, is I think really what I hope we can also, yeah, get moving forward.
Can I just maybe raise the question to both Martha and Dominic about this and to Kim indeed. Sometimes when we're working with drug companies on a collaborative study, and they've had a study already approved, either as an IPSP or a PIP, but when we've looked at it, it won't, just from what we know, this will not be a feasible study. It will not be run, and they really should have come and discussed it with the academics earlier, but clearly haven't. But there is a huge reluctance to go back and have the discussions with the regulators, because they feel, and and I'm quoting what I hear, oh, we don't know what they might ask us for next. It's this kind of like almost adversarial. And I just wonder if there's anything that can be done, and this is more in big pharma than it is in small pharma, to help them understand that actually it's a positive process to come back and end up with an approved study that'll actually be deliverable. It'll actually be feasible, because just ploughing on could mean that they'll open a study that will never be delivered.
Okay, I'm sorry there. I work in a government institution, so at 7 o'clock local time, apparently the internet connection is disconnected. We all have to go home. I strongly apologize for that mishap. I was hoping things like this would not happen. So Pam, please continue. You were saying something.
I posed my question to Martha and Dominic, who were both laughing at the question, but I was interested in their answer.
Yeah, I mean, Martha, do you want to start, and then I give our perspective.
You can start. You can go for it.
I find this always so interesting to hear, because it's, at the end of the day, yes, you have a PIP in place, and that's a mandated requirement to conduct a study and a development as agreed. But that, I mean, first of all, it's a plan and not a protocol to start with. So this is one thing. Secondly, is that of course there is a very strong recognition that any decision making with regard to pediatric requirements or PIP from a European perspective should be driven by science and by evidence. That subsequently means that unless all the science and evidence is brought forward on the table, sometimes decisions are then made based on only what has been brought forward and put on the table. If then new evidence comes to light, then we are more than happy, and the committee, the PDCO, is more than happy to modify any agreed pediatric investigation plan. And that's, I'm always, a PIP, see it as an evolution science and evidence, and as an opportunity to engage with regulators. And I think that's what we're trying to sort of, you know, do also. We try to foster evidence generation really in a way that drug development of that specific product is going to be feasible, and equally going to generate the data necessary for decision making or benefit risk. So I'm always surprised why industry is not more keen to engage, because this is an opportunity, and we will not be able, and we are not even allowed to add any requirements into a PIP which are, you know, out of own motions. We can't. We can only modify what has been agreed. So it's, and we have closed PIPs into waivers. We have, I mean, I can reassure you that any engagement with new data and evidence, bringing to light and bringing it onto the table, is always welcome, and certainly a great asset towards changing agreed plans.
I think Ellie and Mark, this provokes a response from industry, right? Is that an attitude that isn't well embedded, or?
I guess I can't deny that to some degree that there's a little bit of trepidation every time industry engages with regulators, because, you know, the outcome of the conversations, discussions, plans are, you know, are what we will then, you know, execute on, right? And so yeah, so I guess sometimes there's a feeling of, you know, well, we know what we've committed to, we kind of know the plan, so to speak, and now we're opening the door, and now we introduce some uncertainty. So I can't deny that there's a little bit of you know, fear around that, but you know, again, I think the purpose of these types of conversations and this forum is to really you know, introduce the idea of us all as partners in this endeavor, and really to maybe, you know, demystify some of the perceptions, so that you know, we others in industry, you know, are, you know, see these types of conversations as being really collaborative and productive, and just part of a broader collaboration.
Yeah, it is somewhat like it sometimes feels like getting called into the principal's office. You haven't done anything wrong, but at the same time, you know that the stakes are high, and you don't want to make a mistake, particularly because, and this is again where it's critically important for pharma, right? Pediatrics is not driving most large pharma companies. The adult thing is, and the one thing that your boss is going to be thinking about is, could your pediatric discussion mess something up for the larger initiative on which the entire company's, you know, development is based? And so it is like walking a little bit on broken glass. You have to be very careful what you say and do, both because of the issues on the industry side, but also on the regulatory side. And maybe that's also just part of something we have to get over and deal with in our own minds.
Yeah. But one of the strongest recommendations that we formulated in the paper is actually that we should remain considerate about commitments that were made by the other partner if we engage in an interaction. Do we feel as academic partners that we are aware of that when we discuss with pharma, of what their goals are, what we committed to, what they committed to? Is that, or might there be issues there? Beth, please, or Pam, or
I'll say in the cooperative group setting in the US, when we engage in early discussions with pharmaceutical partners, it's one of the questions we routinely ask. What are your regulatory obligations? Where are you at with your regulatory obligations? As a way of understanding the position, because we recognize that those are critically important to everyone in moving an asset forward. I think it's a little different on the institutional level. I'm not sure those questions get asked quite as often or in the same way or at the same time. Pam, your thoughts?
Well, I would say that we would definitely ask those questions as well. We're starting out on a collaboration with pharma with a new asset. We'd always ask where they are up to in the development plan. I think it comes back to a comment that we raised right at the beginning was, at what point do we have those discussions? And quite often it's a little bit too late. The industry have come to ask whether our European group will work with them on delivering a particular trial, but the trial has already been too far down the agreement with one or other of the regulators, and for us it's usually the EMA. And that's where I'm saying that when you go, well, that might not be the way we can deliver it, depending, for all sorts of different reasons, that's where we hit the blockade. And it's not just being awkward or not recognizing the importance of what's been approved, but sometimes it's just not feasible. They've missed what is actually feasible in that patient population in the context of the current treatment. So I think, yes, the question is asked. It's just whether we can actually really bring those discussions much earlier before they're discussed and approved at the regulatory level, and make sure that there's been genuine academic input. And what I mean by genuine academic input, and I really don't want to sound like I'm having a go at industry, because we work really well with industry, but sometimes we can get involved in advisory boards where a panel of different specialists give their opinion, but what comes out at the other end as a summary is not the same as actually working together collaboratively and designing the study. It's a kind of almost lowest common denominator of the collective opinion, and that is not, to me, collaborating on the development of a drug. That's where I think we need to be more engaged at an early stage and working all the way through on the pathway.
Mm-hmm. Donna, I'm very keen to hear the opinion of you as a parent representative, as a stakeholder on.
Thank you, Bram, because I do have a question about that. We all agree that the multi-stakeholder early discussions is going to be the best route, in the long run. But related to what Pam just said about these advisories and the timing, recently, I and another advocate were invited on this advisory panel for a drug development, but they had not spoken to any regulators yet. And so there were academics giving advice exactly as Pam said, whether or not they were going to follow through. But here's the part that struck me. They kept making assumptions about what regulators would say. And I asked the question, well, have you talked to, the FDA or EMA? And like, no. Back to what you were saying, Mark, probably the hesitation. But to me, it's very much a roundabout way of doing things if there isn't a true open discussion. And then I have to put in a plug for advocates, who might have good input to give on the feasibility of some trials. Pam, you're exactly right. We've seen trials that they obviously didn't talk to any parents, because you see them open and a year later close and no one accrued, and for good reason, because it's not a very direct trial. So I think really this brings home that message that these kinds of open discussions, and this is something I'm kind of confused about, is how much regulators can get involved in discussions in a multi-stakeholder setting. In other words, if a company goes to a regulator, are academics invited along? Could they ever have advocates invited along? Then it's a real multi-stakeholder discussion, right? Or does it have to be done stepwise and kind of roundabout? So just a question. I don't know if that's
Mark, I think that's an open point of discussion. I think you had a comment, so please.
Yeah, Donna, you gave me a perfect lead in to what I wanted to say, so good. Thank you. I think a lot of what used to happen in the past and still happens to some degree are these like three-way kind of conversations where industry will talk to us, industry will talk to academicians and advocacy groups and academicians. So, but yet we don't have the opportunity, as we do in sort of an informal setting through the Accelerate program, for example, and opportunities like today, we haven't in the past often, had formal meetings where there was, the academic people at the table and the patient advocates at the table, along with pharma representatives, to discuss concrete development programs in a setting where we are crafting agreements regarding, once we get to the brass tacks of what a study design is going to look like and what the role of that study will be in the clinical development program. And so oftentimes I feel, and I'm sure colleagues would share this, I feel like I'm, sometimes operating with very, not all of the information that I would like to have, because I'm relying on one perspective, or I'm hearing, like playing the telephone game. Well, I'll hear from an industry representative, well, we did go speak to academia, and, this is what so-and-so said, and, et cetera. And that makes it a little more difficult for us to really feel confident that we understand the current state of whether the trial is feasible, whether there's a lot of excitement on the behalf of the community, at large, about doing a trial like this. What aspects of what we're asking for are too much or not feasible? It doesn't. That's not the best environment to make important decisions. So, I have seen more companies, coming with formal meetings to discuss important topics relating to drug development, both for adult cancers and for pediatric cancers, where we are starting to see more involvement from, maybe the lead PI who's going to be running this, or, and sometimes advocates as well. And, that I think is helpful, because it increases the chance that we're all going to hear the same thing, that we're going to get the information that we need. And, I think as a regulator, we really appreciate knowing who's going to be there, so we're not kind of blindsided about, somebody being present that we didn't anticipate was going to be present. But I think that the tide is shifting. I'd like to see that happen a lot more, frankly. Many times when we're reviewing our initial pediatric study plan proposals, and they are just plans, as Dominic so rightly pointed out, they're high-level plans. And for us, it's for a molecularly targeted, pediatric investigation that's basically a phase 1, phase 2 trial. We often put comments, back to the sponsor. Have you spoken with, experts in this area on this trial? Can you provide support for us that this is, feasible or not feasible? I think we do want to hear, what actually is going to work for the community at large. And the last thing we want to do is require a study that isn't going to get off the ground, or maybe get started and then peters out because there's no interest in enrollment. Yeah. I do understand it's a risk, and I do understand the fear of putting myself in the, trying to put myself in the place of pharmaceutical representatives. I totally understand how it might be scary, and I would be lying if I didn't, if I said that sometimes these additional discussions don't end up with like a shift in plan, because of course that's part of the whole purpose for the meeting, right? Is to kind of touch base on a plan. And we'll try to make it less like walking on broken glass, and maybe, more like walking on styrofoam or something a little less jagged. We can work toward that together.
Understanding each other's opinion is actually key to and I think really came out of the discussion that there was too limited an understanding of that. And we're closing into the 1 hour discussion point. I think we still have some time for maybe some smaller questions. There was in the Q&A, and I'm sorry I got disconnected and I lost the Q&A questions. There was a question on trial endpoints and the differences that might exist there in academic, and I think we also had a lot of discussion on the adverse event reporting and the difference that might exist in academically run trials, industry run trials there. But I do see, Mark, that you are compelled to have another comment there.
Well, it wasn't so much. The one thing I did want to do, because obviously the low-hanging fruit is always the place to start, and I hope Natalie Gaspar would agree with this, that if of all of the things we've talked about for fit for filing, the adult trials are already fit for filing. They're in fact typically pharmaceutically run, and simply including kids down to age 12 would already encompass the opportunity to get them approved without having to do any of the things we've just spent the last hour talking about. So here's an easy way to have a huge impact quickly if companies can think about this from their side. But even for academics, you know, are the pediatric, when some of the adults are opening trials, is anybody on the pediatric side speaking to the adult? Is there a reason why this couldn't be expanded out as an opportunity to incorporate some, at least the adolescents early on? And in doing so, when the adult approval comes, you would already have at least the 12 and above accounted for without having to really do virtually any other work. So I just wanted to raise that as perhaps the easiest thing to get done quickly.
You clearly have a fan in Natalie, because she's very much agreeing with you. Ellie, please.
I just wanted to make a comment to the question around endpoints, because obviously we want to use in our trials, you know, whatever we think is the best and the best endpoint that will reflect benefit to patients. On the industry side, I think we often feel like, you know, we have, obviously because we're meeting regulatory requirements, right? There's, you know, certain endpoints that are accepted by FDA, right? And you know, that's usually where we start. But if there is interest beyond that, I think this is where the academic community can help, right? By generating the evidence and also being partners with industry, right? To, you know, to bring the evidence to FDA to really shift the conversation. So I just wanted to make that point, because obviously we're interested, we're always interested in novel endpoints to test our drugs, but it's really having evidence to take to FDA to have a conversation to say, well, this is an endpoint that really should be considered. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay, thank you.
So I just want to follow on Mark's comment. You know, I think we've made huge strides by being able to treat adolescent patients more broadly. I do think we have to monitor that situation and be aware that if we go ahead and get approval for greater than 12 years of age and we're successful in that, what is the regulatory and other commitments to making sure that drugs are available to patients under 12? And, you know, I think part of the challenge there becomes the care models in which adult trials are opened. And are we talking about more sites? Are we talking about making sure an appropriate number of younger patients are enrolled? I think these are the practical questions that take a really great idea that has gotten traction. But, you know, as Mark puts it, it's low-hanging fruit. And I think pediatric drug development also has to include the appropriate ages and making sure that we, by making progress in one area, we're not eliminating the ability to study drugs in the youngest patient populations.
Yeah, Michaela Casanova is actually commenting that the reality is that the number of adolescent patients that actually enroll in these types of trials is actually quite low. Should we enforce this? Should that be part of the pediatric investigational plan, that at least a number of patients below whatever age should be included?
That may be out of scope for fit for filing.
It is a bit.
I just want to acknowledge that, but I think it's an important point because it is a way forward. Those trials, I fully agree. The regulatory pathway for those trials at least appears to be a little bit more straightforward because it's not a whole separate trial. I agree with all of those things. I could assume the investment pays off, and you know, we're certainly really supportive in the academic environment of those trials, but we also want to look a little bit beyond those.
And maybe just to add, it's happening. I want to reassure people that age-inclusive research, including age-inclusive filing, actually is reality. Within reflected in PIPs, but also in positive opinions by the CHMP, the agency sort of authorizing committee. So it's happening. It's reality.
Change is possible. So okay.
I just wonder if I could, you might have lost it when you lost your signal, but there was a question from Enrico about functional endpoints. And if I've understood him correctly, I think he might be talking more about the kind of patient-reported outcomes, qualitative endpoints, as opposed to just measuring our traditional event-free survival, overall survival. And I think this is a really important point because there's certainly been a number of publications recently, not just from the academic sector, but also from the regulators about using patient-reported outcome measures as genuine endpoints, not just an add-on for a quality of life study that can contribute to the whether the benefit risk analysis as to whether a drug gets licensed or not. And it's something that I think we are really poised to develop now in pediatric oncology. We do a lot of quality of life studies in academic studies, but not really with that endpoint in mind, to look at the licensing of drugs. And I think it's an area that absolutely needs to be explored, because yes, obviously we want new drugs that improve survival, that's without question, but it is not always survival at no cost whatsoever. And we need to be looking at the quality of life that we generate with these new drugs, particularly with some of the drugs that are going to end up being given over the long term. You know, we're not just giving drugs just for 3 weeks or a week and then 3 weeks off and give them again. We're going into an era of continuous dosing, and those drugs might have longer term side effects with impacts on life, on quality of life. So I think it is an important point that we need to develop.
It absolutely is, and thank you for picking up that question, Pam. I had indeed lost it. I maybe want to point it to Donna for, I mean, facing that situation where you're bound to take experimental therapy, and I mean these kinds of things matter, right?
Absolutely. It's a really good point, because there's a lot of data on the patient forums about this. There's a lot of self-reporting going on and a lot of observations being made, and I think it's extremely important. One of the, of course, challenges is how long does a trial go in order to capture data that goes quite far out, and the logistics and expense that goes with that is a challenge. But there should be a way, and this kind of relates to even the adverse events, reporting, not just the quality of life issues, but the adverse events. I think more could be done to gather, to engage the families to report that. An example of that was the ocular effects from dinutuximab. Early on, families were talking about it on the forums before it was recognized within the academic communities. It was kind of a fascinating case of that sort of thing. So anyway, yes, I agree. We should definitely advance that line of thinking.
And I want to direct that question to the academic people here, is that we have a nature of tolerating quite a bit of AEs and not necessarily reporting them in our trial databases because we're accustomed to that. Is that an attitude we need to change? Is that something we need to mitigate? Is that?
I'm not sure that we tolerate them. And I think this comes back to how we do the fit for filing studies. Mm-hmm. I think in a normal academic study, the safety data we collect is probably underreported for exactly the reason that you said, that we're so familiar with the side effects of drugs that we are familiar with using. We don't think they need to be reported. And in fact, a lot of the trial protocols exclude, for example, hospitalization for febrile neutropenia as a serious adverse event doesn't need to be included. Where I think the really important discussions need to happen, and we covered this a lot in our working group, is that when you're going to do a trial for fit for filing and you're adding in an unlicensed drug, what's the safety data that does need to be collected? Because that safety data is important if it's then going to be used in combinations with chemotherapy, and that we don't, by being, I'm going to use the word complacent, I think you'll understand what I mean, but just going, oh yeah, we know that drug does that, actually fail to collect important safety data. But at the same time, I mentioned it earlier on, we don't want to be collecting so much that we actually lose the important, we lose it in the noise. And it's much easier when you're talking about just a single drug in an early phase study or a single arm phase 2 study. When you start bringing that drug into combination therapy where it's on a background of other toxicity, I think that's where the discussion with the regulators about with the drug companies who understand their asset, but also the regulators about is what is the set that needs to be collected, what is reasonable and what are we not going to collect, that we just lose the important data in the noise. And I think that's challenging even for industries to run trials, not just for academia trying to run filing studies.
I think Kim, maybe you can comment as an inspector. Is all staff involved in these trials always adequately aware of these things, that you can either mitigate, limit, protocol specify AE reporting and still have a good trial fit for filing, or
Yeah, I mean, one thing is we always say safety comes first, and when we start to saying, okay, we are not collecting these safety signals in the first place. So, and then I think where it becomes important, okay, who is collecting then those information? If we have really specialized people in the field there, then we can trust them. And one of the things is also where we put like an emphasis on proper training as well. So if everything goes wide, and we are not talking about like a first class new molecule or more better characterized product, there could be a discussion going on. But then again, also going back to the data management, it's like also something got lost in the way. If we don't collect it in the first place, there's no way, if we think that the process was not robust enough, to really get like to the adequate safety profile, which would likely preclude then the usability for regulatory decision making. I don't know, Dominic, if or others you want to add on this. I know there have been like an example out there where this decision was taken under specific circumstances to limit the collection of safety signals.
Yeah, Dominic, please do. But
no, I'm very conscious of time as well. But
yes, exactly.
But yeah. I mean, very quickly as an add-on to what Kim said, I think it's always context specific, right? I mean, if this is a first in child, first in human study, then obviously we would want to know what does the safety profile look like, and that includes, you know, respective safety data collection. If in the case we've put out in the publication, it's a product where a pivotal study using a different pathology has already been undergone regulatory review, and a new pivotal trial comes along with a new dosing regimen, then certainly this is a different ball game. Then we can talk about, you know, risk proportionate safety data collection. But so I think it's always context specific, and
yes,
that's important to bear in mind in the message.
I want to address the attention of the attendees to the fact that we will be addressing this in the follow-up webinar that we have planned. So stay tuned, I would say. I think unless anyone has any very urgent or compelling messages that they still want to add on to it before we start bleeding attendees too much, we should wrap up for today. And we, of course, hope to see all of the attendants in the next webinar as well. We will be quizzing you, we will be probing you, we will be harassing you in the next webinar. So come along for the ride. And thank you to the panel. Thank you for being here, for your valuable insights, and see you in 1 month. Goodbye.